On the night of the 14th of April, 1912, in the freezing middle of the North Atlantic, a wealthy American businessman did something that would be remembered for more than a century. As the RMS Titanic tilted toward the black water and panic spread across the decks, he did not fight for a lifeboat. Instead, he went back to his cabin and he changed his clothes. He put on his finest evening wear, a full formal suit, and he pinned a rose to his lapel. Then he returned to the deck, poured himself a brandy, lit a cigar, and reportedly told a steward to carry a message to his wife. He had, he said, done his best in doing his duty. And then, according to the survivors who lived to repeat the story, he settled in to die like a gentleman. His name was Benjamin Guggenheim, and he was one of the richest men on that doomed ship. He was also, in a way that no one aboard could have known, a living symbol of a family at the very peak of its power, a dynasty so wealthy that its name would eventually be carved onto museums, foundations, and fellowships across the world. The Guggenheims, in that era, were among the richest families that had ever existed in America, rivals to the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, a clan that had risen from a single penniless immigrant peddler into a global mining empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars in an age when a dollar was worth a fortune. And yet, for all that wealth, for all that power, the story of the Guggenheim family is not a story of triumph. It is one of the most haunting cautionary tales in the entire history of American money, a story of how a family that quite literally had everything, more money than almost anyone alive, museums bearing their name, senators and philanthropists and pioneers among their ranks, was nonetheless stalked by tragedy at every turn. A patriarch's empire that his heirs could not hold together. A son who went down with the Titanic. Children who took their own lives. A granddaughter who became one of the most famous women in the art world and yet buried her own daughter after a lifetime of despair. And a great fortune that, within just a few generations, largely melted away. There is a strange and unsettling lesson buried in the Guggenheim story, one that cuts against everything the American dream is supposed to promise. We are taught that if you can only climb high enough, accumulate enough, secure enough wealth and power, you and yours will finally be safe. The Guggenheims climbed as high as almost anyone in American history. They had the mansions, the yachts, the private empires, the museums with their name over the door, and it protected them from nothing. Not from the sea, not from despair, not from the slow erosion of time. If anything, their story suggests that the higher a family climbs, the further and the more publicly it has to fall. This is the story of the Guggenheims, the family that had everything, and lost far more than money. Let's begin at the very beginning, with the man who built it all out of nothing. The peddler who built an empire. The Guggenheim story begins not in a mansion, but in a tiny Jewish ghetto in the village of Lengno, in Switzerland, where Jews at the time were subject to harsh restrictions and grinding poverty. It was from there, in 1847, that a young man named Meyer Guggenheim emigrated to America with his family, arriving with essentially nothing, another anonymous immigrant among the millions pouring into the young country in search of a better life. Meyer began at the very bottom. He was a peddler, walking door to door through the coal regions of Pennsylvania, selling stove polish and household goods out of a pack on his back. But he had an extraordinary gift for business and a relentless drive to rise. He noticed that the stove polish he sold left stains on people's hands, so he developed a better formula and manufactured it himself. From there he moved into importing, into spices, into lye, steadily building capital and a reputation as a shrewd and tireless trader. By the standards of most immigrants of his era, he had already succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. But Meyer Guggenheim was not most immigrants. He was just getting started. The great turn came in the 1880s when Meyer made an investment that would change everything. He bought a stake in 2 mines in Leadville, Colorado, that turned out to be spectacularly rich in silver, lead, and copper. Almost overnight, the stove polish peddler found himself sitting on a mountain of mineral wealth. But Meyer, ever the strategist, understood something crucial. The real money was not just in digging the ore out of the ground. It was in smelting, in the process of cooking that raw ore down into pure, usable, valuable metal. He moved the family aggressively into the smelting business, and in doing so, he laid the foundation of an empire. And here is the detail that made the Guggenheims different from almost every other tycoon of the Gilded Age. Meyer had 7 sons, and he raised them, quite deliberately, to be a single, unbreakable unit. He gathered them into the family business one by one, drilled into them the idea that their strength lay in absolute loyalty to one another, and famously illustrated the lesson with a bundle of sticks. A single stick, he showed them, could be snapped in an instant. But 7 sticks bound together could not be broken. As long as the brothers stayed united, he told them, no force on earth could destroy the family. It was a powerful and moving idea. It was also, as the decades would prove, a promise the family could not keep. For a time, though, the bundle held, and it held with astonishing force. What made the Guggenheim brothers so formidable was precisely that they moved as one. When they wanted to break into a new market, 7 brothers pushed together. When a rival tried to squeeze them out, 7 brothers closed ranks. In an era of ruthless industrial warfare, when titans like the Rockefellers and Morgans crushed anyone who stood in their way, the Guggenheims were nearly impossible to defeat because there was no single point of weakness to attack. They famously faced down some of the most powerful financial interests in America and came out on top, muscling their way into control of enterprises that others had assumed were beyond their reach. Meyer had not just built a fortune. He had built a machine of 7 parts that functioned as one, and for a generation it seemed genuinely unstoppable. Under Meyer and his 7 sons, the Guggenheim Empire exploded across the globe. They came to control an enormous share of the world's copper, silver, and other metals, with mining and smelting operations stretching from Colorado to Alaska to Mexico to Chile to the Congo. They took control of the American Smelting and Refining Company, known as ASARCO, one of the largest corporations in the entire country. By the years around the First World War, the Guggenheim family fortune was estimated at somewhere around $300 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for the time, placing them among the wealthiest families in the world. Meyer Guggenheim died in 1905, having achieved something almost no immigrant peddler ever dreams of. He had built one of the great fortunes of the age and handed it, intact, to 7 united sons. On paper, the family had everything, but the cracks, invisible at first, were already beginning to form. And the first great fracture would come from the son who decided he wanted out. The Silver Prince and the Titanic. Of Meyer's 7 sons, 5 threw themselves fully into the family business and became the pillars of the empire. Daniel, the eldest and most powerful, became the true head of the family after Meyer's death. Murray, Isaac, Solomon, and Simon all played major roles in running the vast mining and smelting operations. But the 5th son, Benjamin, was different. He was restless, charming, and independent, and while he had genuine business talent, he did not have his brother's appetite for the grinding, collective labor of holding the empire together. As a young man, Benjamin had actually been one of the family's rising stars. At just 20 years old, his father sent him to run the family's operations in the rough mining town of Leadville, Colorado, and he acquitted himself so well that they called him the Silver Prince. It was reportedly Benjamin's own vision that helped push the family decisively into smelting, the very move that built the empire. But as the years passed, Benjamin grew restless within the family partnership, and around 1910, he did the unthinkable. He pulled out. He terminated his partnership with his brothers, relinquished his stake in the great collective fortune, and struck out on his own to build a separate business, primarily in mining machinery and pumps. It was, in hindsight, a catastrophic decision. His brothers stayed united and went on to even greater riches through ASARCO. Benjamin, on his own, watched his independent ventures struggle. His personal fortune, once enormous, began to erode under the weight of poor investments and mounting debts. By the time of his death, the man who had walked away from one of the world's greatest fortunes was, on paper, worth a fraction of what his brothers commanded, much of it tied up in the shares of his own struggling company, against which he had borrowed heavily. Meyer's bundle of sticks had lost one of its number, and the stick that broke away had begun, quietly, to break. Benjamin's personal life had unraveled alongside his finances. He had married Florette Seligman, a member of a prominent and wealthy Jewish banking family, and together they had 3 daughters. But Benjamin was a restless philanderer who spent more and more of his time in Europe, largely estranged from his wife, living the life of a jet-setting bachelor in Paris. And so it was that in April of 1912, when he boarded the most famous ship in the world to return to New York, he did so not with his wife, but in the company of a young French singer, his mistress, along with her maid, his valet, and his chauffeur. We know how that voyage ended. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, Benjamin Guggenheim, by the accounts of those who survived, behaved with a calm and gallant dignity that turned him into a legend. He and his valet helped women and children into the lifeboats. And then, understanding that there would be no place for them, the 2 men went below, dressed in their finest formal clothes, and returned to the deck to face the end with composure. His famous last message, sent through a steward to his wife, declared that no woman would be left aboard that ship because Benjamin Guggenheim was a coward. His body was never recovered. It was a heroic death, and it made his name immortal. The image of Benjamin Guggenheim in his evening clothes, a rose in his lapel, calmly awaiting the end with a brandy in hand, became one of the enduring legends of the Titanic disaster, retold in books and films for more than a century. There is something genuinely admirable in it, a man who, whatever his failings in life, chose to meet death with grace and courage rather than clawing for survival at another's expense. But strip away the romance of it, and consider what it actually was. A middle-aged man, estranged from his family, his fortune crumbling, travelling with his mistress rather than his wife, drowned in the icy Atlantic at the age of 46, his body never recovered, lost forever to the black water. He left behind a widow and 3 young daughters, one of whom was just 13 years old. And there is a bitter irony layered into the whole thing. Benjamin had walked away from the family fortune in search of independence and his own success. And it was that very decision that had left him financially exposed and personally adrift, the estranged husband on a doomed ship. Had he stayed bound in his father's bundle of sticks, his whole life might have looked different. That 13-year-old girl, meanwhile, who lost her father to the most famous shipwreck in history, would grow up to become the most famous Guggenheim of them all, and her life would prove that the family's tragedies were only beginning. Peggy Guggenheim and the sorrow behind the glamour. Marguerite Guggenheim, known to the world as Peggy, was Benjamin's middle daughter, and she was forever marked by the loss of her father on the Titanic when she was a child. She grew up wealthy but emotionally adrift, an awkward, unhappy girl in a family of enormous means, and when she came into an inheritance in her early 20s, she did something no proper young woman of her background was expected to do. She fled to Europe, to Bohemian Paris, and threw herself headlong into the wild avant-garde art world of the 1920s. What followed was one of the most remarkable lives of the 20th century. Peggy Guggenheim became a legendary art collector, patron and gallery owner, a woman with an extraordinary eye and a fearless appetite for the new and the shocking. She opened galleries in London and New York, and during the Second World War she became a crucial early champion of artists who would go on to define modern art, figures like Jackson Pollock, whom she supported and promoted when almost no one else believed in him. She befriended and collected the Surrealists and the Abstract Expressionists, married the artist Max Ernst, and assembled one of the most important private collections of modern art in the world, which she eventually installed in a palazzo on the Grand Canal in Venice, where it remains a beloved museum to this day. There is a real case to be made that Peggy Guggenheim did more to shape the course of 20th century art than almost any other single collector. In the darkest days of the war, as the Nazis advanced across Europe and branded modern art as degenerate, Peggy raced to buy up masterpieces that might otherwise have been lost, reportedly resolving to purchase a painting a day. She rescued not only artworks but artists themselves, helping figures flee occupied Europe for safety in America. And when she got there, her New York gallery became a launching pad for the entire American abstract movement, giving unknown painters their first serious shows. She had inherited a piece of the family's Gilded Age wealth, and rather than simply preserving it, she spent it on the future, on artists the establishment dismissed as frauds and lunatics. betting on them with an audacity that history proved right again and again. On the surface, it was a dazzling, glamorous life. Peggy moved among the greatest artists of her age, lived in a Venetian palace, and became a genuine icon of 20th century culture. She was famous for her bohemian lifestyle, her countless love affairs, and her sharp, self-deprecating wit. But beneath the glamour ran a deep and persistent current of sorrow. And nowhere was that clearer than in her relationship with her own daughter. Peggy had 2 children from her first marriage, a son, Sindbad, and a daughter, Pegeen. And Pegeen's life became the family's next great tragedy. Like her mother, Pegeen was a gifted artist, a painter of genuine talent whose dreamlike, naive style earned real recognition. But she struggled all her life with depression, a darkness that never fully lifted. And by many accounts, her relationship with her brilliant, distracted, emotionally ill-equipped mother only deepened her pain. Peggy herself later admitted, with unusual honesty, that she had been a hapless and inadequate mother. Pegeen's adult life was punctuated by repeated suicide attempts, cries for help that grew more desperate over the years. On the 1st of March 1967, in her apartment in Paris, Pegeen Vale Guggenheim died of an overdose of barbiturates. She was just 41 years old. Her death was ruled the result of an overdose, and while her mother refused to accept that it had been a suicide, launching a bitter legal battle and blaming Pegeen's husband, those closest to the situation understood it as the tragic culmination of a lifetime of depression. Peggy received the news by telegram while traveling in Mexico, and she was shattered. She would later write of Pegeen as the great love of her life, describing her lost daughter as having been to her a mother, a friend, and a sister all at once. Think about the cruel symmetry of it. Peggy Guggenheim had lost her own father to a catastrophe when she was a child, and now, in her old age, she had lost her own child to a catastrophe of a different kind. She spent her final years in her Venetian palazzo, surrounded by priceless masterpieces and adoring visitors, and yet haunted by grief, her most precious possession not any painting on the wall, but the daughter she could never save. When Peggy herself died in 1979, her ashes were buried in the garden of her palazzo, beside the graves of her beloved dogs, and near the daughter she had outlived. But Peggy and Pegeen were not the only Guggenheim stalked by this kind of private darkness. In fact, across the wider family, the pattern of young lives lost repeated itself again and again, in ways that turned the dynasty's greatest philanthropic monuments into memorials of grief. The foundations built on lost children. Here is one of the most poignant truths about the Guggenheim family, one that most people who recognize the famous name never realize. Some of the family's most celebrated and enduring achievements, the philanthropic institutions that carry the Guggenheim name around the world, were born directly out of the deaths of the family's own children. Consider Simon Guggenheim, one of Maya's 7 sons. Simon was a genuine pillar of the family, a successful businessman who rose to become president of ASARCO, and who even served a term as a United States Senator from Colorado in the early 20th century. He and his wife Olga had 2 sons, and they represented the future of that branch of the family. But tragedy came for them, twice. In 1922, their elder son, John Simon Guggenheim, a promising young scholar of just 17, died of complications from an illness just as he was about to leave for college. The loss devastated his parents, and out of that devastation came something extraordinary. In their grief, Simon and Olga decided to create a lasting memorial to their lost boy. In 1925, they established the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, dedicated to supporting scholars, scientists, and artists in their creative work. That foundation created the Guggenheim Fellowships, which have gone on to become among the most prestigious grants in the world, awarded to thousands upon thousands of writers, researchers, and creators over the past century, including some of the most important minds and artists of the modern age. A century after its founding, the foundation has awarded hundreds of millions of dollars to nearly 20,000 individuals. Every one of those fellowships, in a sense, is a tribute to a 17-year-old boy who never got to grow up. But the sorrow of Simon and Olga's story did not end there. In 1939, their second and only surviving son, George, died by suicide in a Manhattan hotel at the age of 32. And so Simon Guggenheim, senator, industrialist, and philanthropist, a man who had helped build one of the greatest fortunes in the world, ended his life having outlived both of his children, both of his sons gone before him, one to illness and one to despair. He died in 1941, and that branch of the great Guggenheim line simply ended with him. All the money in the world had not been able to buy him the one thing he most wanted, which was to see his children survive. The pattern echoed elsewhere in the family. The great aviation legacy of the Guggenheims, the funds and laboratories that helped pioneer American flight and rocketry, grew out of the passions of Daniel Guggenheim and his son, Harry, who poured family money into the earliest days of aviation and even bankrolled the pioneering rocketry experiments of Robert Goddard, helping lay the groundwork for the space age itself. Harry went on to co-found the newspaper Newsday and to establish his own foundation. And even the world-famous Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, that spiraling Frank Lloyd Wright masterpiece on Fifth Avenue in New York, was the creation of another of Meyer's sons, Solomon, who poured his mining fortune into building one of the most important collections and museums of modern art on the planet, a building so radical in its design that it remains instantly recognizable the world over. The Guggenheim name became synonymous with cultural philanthropy on the grandest scale. But so much of that generosity, that impulse to build something permanent and meaningful, seemed to flow from a family that had learned, over and over, how fragile and fleeting its own members' lives could be. The family that had everything kept turning its private griefs into public gifts. And in the meantime, the source of all that wealth, the mighty industrial empire Meyer had built, was quietly slipping away. The empire fades. For all the museums and foundations and fellowships, the hard truth is that the Guggenheims, as a great industrial dynasty, did not endure. The bundle of sticks did eventually break. The problems were partly a matter of the changing world. The Guggenheim fortune had been built on mining and smelting, on physical control of the world's metals, and over the middle decades of the 20th century, that world transformed. Foreign governments in the countries where the Guggenheims had their richest operations, particularly in Latin America, moved to nationalize their mines, seizing the very assets that had made the family rich. The great copper and nitrate holdings in Chile and elsewhere, once the jewels of the empire, passed out of Guggenheim hands. The industrial base of the fortune eroded, decade by decade. But there was also a more human problem, the same one that quietly began with Benjamin walking away from the partnership before the Titanic. Meyer had built the empire on the absolute unity of his 7 sons. But that kind of unity is almost impossible to maintain across generations. The 3rd and 4th generations of Guggenheim scattered into different interests, different cities, different lives. Many of them, understandably, had little desire to spend their lives in the brutal, unglamorous business of mining and smelting. They became art collectors and aviators and socialites and philanthropists, which is a testament to their range and their culture, but it also meant that fewer and fewer of them were minding the industrial empire that generated the money in the first place. And so the great fortune dispersed, divided among ever more descendants with each generation, drained by the loss of the foreign mines, and no longer fed by a unified family business. The immense Guggenheim wealth gradually diminished. There was no single dramatic collapse, no sudden bankruptcy. Instead, there was a slow, steady fading, the quiet dissolution of one of the largest fortunes America had ever produced. By the later 20th century, while the Guggenheim name remained enormously prestigious, attached to world-famous museums and foundations, the family no longer commanded anything like the staggering industrial power it had wielded in Meyer's day. The empire, for all practical purposes, was gone. It is worth understanding just how ordinary this fate actually is, even for the most extraordinary fortunes. There is an old saying about great wealth, that it goes from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, that the first generation builds it, the second generation enjoys it, and the third generation loses it. The Guggenheims were far too cultured and too philanthropic to fit that saying neatly, but the underlying arithmetic caught up with them all the same. A fortune concentrated in one determined man becomes, a few generations later, a fortune split among dozens of heirs, each with their own lives and passions and expenses. Add to that a changing world that seized the mines and reshaped the industries the money was built on, and even $300 million, an almost unimaginable sum in its day, could not remain the towering force it once had been. The very abundance that had made the Guggenheims seem invincible turned out to carry the seeds of its own dispersal. It is a striking thing to sit with. A single immigrant peddler built, from stove polish and silver ore, one of the mightiest fortunes on earth and united 7 sons to protect it. And within just a few generations, that industrial empire had largely melted back into history, leaving behind museums and memories rather than mines and money. Where the legacy stands today, more than a century after Benjamin Guggenheim went down with the Titanic, and after all the losses that followed, what remains of the family that had everything? The answer, remarkably, is not the money. The great mining and smelting empire is long gone, the fortune dispersed among descendants and diminished by history. What survives, and survives magnificently, is the philanthropic legacy. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York remains one of the most iconic buildings and important art institutions in the world. Its spiraling white form instantly recognizable, and the Guggenheim name now graces sister museums in cities like Venice and Bilbao. The Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice, housed in the palazzo where Peggy lived and grieved, draws hundreds of thousands of visitors a year to see the modern masterpieces she gathered. The John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, born from the death of a 17-year-old boy, continues to award its prestigious fellowships a full century after its founding, having supported nearly 20,000 creators and thinkers. The descendants themselves have largely faded from public prominence, scattered across the world, most of them living private lives far removed from the mining barons and Titanic passengers and legendary collectors of earlier generations. A few have remained connected to the family's cultural institutions. Peggy Guggenheim's own granddaughter, Carole Vale, the daughter of Peggy's son Sinbad, has served as the director of the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice, keeping a living Guggenheim connected to the collection her grandmother built. But by and large, the family that once rivaled the Rockefellers has receded into history. Its blood dispersed, its industrial power a memory, its name preserved almost entirely in stone and marble and the endowments of foundations. What their story leaves behind. There is a particular kind of story that America tells itself. The immigrant success story. The rags to riches dream. The penniless newcomer who builds an empire and secures his family's fortune for all time. Meyer Guggenheim lived the first half of that story as fully as any human being ever has. He arrived with nothing and built one of the greatest fortunes in the history of the world. If the story ended there, it would be a triumph. But the story did not end there. And that is the whole point. Because what the Guggenheims reveal, more starkly than almost any family in American history, is that wealth on even the most staggering scale is no shield against sorrow. Meyer's bundle of sticks could not hold. His son drowned in the Atlantic. His granddaughter buried her own child. His son, the senator, outlived both of his boys and watched his line die with him. And the empire he had built with such genius and such will simply faded away within a few generations, nationalized abroad and dispersed at home, until the mightiest mining family in the world was remembered chiefly for its museums. And yet, there is something almost redemptive in what they chose to do with their grief. Again and again, when tragedy struck, the Guggenheims responded not by retreating into bitterness, but by building something lasting and generous for the world, a foundation, a museum, a fellowship, a laboratory, monuments to lost children and to the belief that beauty and knowledge were worth preserving even when the family's own happiness could not be. The money did not save them from tragedy, but out of that tragedy they made gifts that have enriched millions of lives, and that endure long after the fortune itself dissolved. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of the family that had everything, not the copper or the silver or the hundreds of millions of dollars, all of which slipped away, but the spiraling museum on Fifth Avenue, the palazzo on the Grand Canal, the fellowships that still bear a lost boy's name 100 years on. The Guggenheims could not hold on to their fortune, and they could not protect their own from heartbreak. But in the wreckage of both, they left behind something that could not be broken, something more enduring than any bundle of sticks. They turned their sorrow into a gift to the world, and that gift is still giving today. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.